Well, thank you so much, Volker. It's really nice to be here. As you mentioned, I grew up in Germany. I got my undergraduate there before moving to England for my grad studies, and then on to the US. I think for the last 8 years, I've now been at Columbia in the business school, but really coming from psychology and computer science and thinking a little bit about how these two worlds get married. And I always kind of the way that I think about it is really kind of it's like this messy world of human desire, behavior, fears, preferences, and then the somewhat more cold and structured world of math and algorithms. So how do you actually leverage the second one, the latter one, to understand human behavior? And what I've planned for the session is essentially kind of talk a little bit about the content of the book. So this idea that we can use data and algorithms to understand psychology, but not just that, also influence it in a way, right? Once I have an understanding of who you are, how do I potentially use these insights and the knowledge to influence how you think, feel, and behave? And what are some of the consequences of that? And how should we be thinking about it from maybe a regulation point of view, from a technological point of view, and like a data governance point of view? Obviously, I only have around 30 minutes to go through this, so it's going to be a bit of a high-speed tour, and I'm excited for the Q&A later. So let me just pull up the slides to get started here. Okay, I hope you can see them all. Wonderful. Okay, so diving right in. And I wanted to start here in a world that's completely has nothing to do with data and algorithms whatsoever. So this is Vögesheim, which is a village in the southwest corner of Germany that I grew up in. Has about 500 people, or actually, as my parents like to remind me now, is since I left the village, it's grown to 1,000. But I can assure you that it doesn't make much of a difference, because my experience of growing up in this village was really characterized by the community and the other people around me, right? So there was always someone who was looking over my shoulder, observing my behavior. People knew exactly what I was doing on the weekend, who I was dating, what music I was into. And you could also imagine that they were not just in the business of observing behavior and making inferences about who I was, but then also trying to influence my life trajectory and the choices that I was making. So they were not just interested in understanding who I was dating, they were also trying to impact who I was dating. And for me, this experience, and this is really, I've only kind of realized this like a couple of years later when I was thinking about it in the context of data, is the experience of growing up in this village meant two things. On the one hand, it was probably the most incredible experience that I've ever had in terms of this feeling of connectedness and security, right? So there were people who truly understood me. And in many instances, they used that understanding to help me. So they try to help me figure out what I wanted to do after school. Should I take a gap year or not? They connected me with internships. So this feeling that there's a community of people out there who kind of really understands you better than just once in a while meeting you for coffee was really valuable. But then you can also imagine, as any village community, they were also doing that in a way that I didn't necessarily have full control over and appreciate. So there was certainly also this aspect of where people kind of trying to manipulate the choices that I made, and without maybe me even understanding or realizing, but in a way that I didn't appreciate. Now, fast forward, the argument that I make in the book, and the analogy that I've tried to push forward for a while now, is that most of us don't live in a small village, right? I live in New York, barely know my neighbors, but we all, in a way, live in this digital village. So the idea that we all have these digital neighbors that are not blood and flesh, but are actually algorithms who go through a similar process of essentially observing behavior at a pretty broad scale. So that could be anything from the intentional signals that you put out there. So psychologists would think of those as identity claims. Used to be the bumper sticker on your car, the poster that you put up in your bedroom. Now is oftentimes social media, right? So there's these traces that we intentionally put out there to signal both to ourselves and to others, here's the person who I am, or here's the person who I want to be. And I'm happy to talk about this a little bit later on. And then also the second bucket, which we would refer to as behavioral residue. So those are all of the traces that you inadvertently create without really thinking about it. Again, if you think it traditionally speaking, Me running to the bus in the morning, probably a sign that I'm not the most organized person. My bedroom being a complete mess, again, maybe a sign that I'm not the most organized person. Now, in the digital world, there's many, many traces that we don't intentionally put out there, right? There could be anything from you swiping your credit card, your phone capturing your location and social network pretty much 24/7. So those together, both like identity claims and behavioral residue, in a way replicate what my village neighbors used to do back in the day, which is making inferences about your preferences, your habits, your routines, and really getting a pretty intimate understanding of who you are. And the translation of these pieces into something that we can make sense of as humans is what I call psychological targeting. So the idea that we can take data traces, turn it into these psychological constructs, anything from personality, personal values, political ideology, mental health, and then use these insights to, in a second step, potentially change the way that we think, feel, and behave is like essentially part of this entire process. And for all of the data nerds in this audience, the way that I think about it is essentially reading and writing, right? The same way that files have permissions, like you can read, only there's like a write function. I think of it as like, can we read from the mind? So can we take the data as a cue to what's going on inside your psyche, and then also write into your mind, in the sense that we're kind of trying to change how you think about the world, how you feel about the world, and how you show up in the world in terms of behavior. Now, the way that I'm going to go through, and this is also how the book is structured, is essentially I want to give you a brief overview of how does some of this work. And you can imagine that most of this is powered by machine learning, increasingly AI, and like these more flexible transformer models. I'm not going to go into any of the details because happy in the Q&A if someone has questions, but what I think is helpful is just to give you some examples of how what we do online directly translates into something that is meaningful on a deeper psychological level. So it's going to be a lot of examples, some of which are obvious, and you'll see that just kind of gives you a nice sense of it's not rocket science, and it's not just like this black box prediction engine that we have, but a lot of them are kind of intuitively and meaningful. And then there's also some that are surprising, where we actually learn something about psychology that we didn't know before. The second part is where, when I started grad school, I was probably the most excited about this idea of what does it mean. So when I started grad school, that was really just a time when the first papers came out showing that you could predict someone's psychology based on their data. And for me, the big looming question was like, okay, what does it mean? It's amazing for psychologists to be able to do that, and it's super interesting, on an intellectual level, but what does it mean for the people who can now be profiled in that way, for better or worse, right? If I understand who you are, what power does that give me over your behavior? And then the last part, the what now part, is if we believe that equivalent to the village, there's these real opportunities, right? So real opportunities to help people accomplish their goals, to help people be healthier, help people be happier. But there's also these pretty substantial dark sides when it comes to privacy, self-determination, and so on. How do we actually navigate the space? How do we navigate the space in a way that amplifies opportunities and mitigates some of the risks? So again, it's going to be a bit of a high-speed tour. I'm super happy to drill deeper in the Q&A later on. Starting with the how part. And you'll see that this is actually a little bit of an evolution in the way that I think we've gone through the process of making these predictions. The one that I always love to start with is language, because it's so intuitive, right? We can easily relate to some of these relationships. So those are words in people's, in this case, Facebook status updates, but you can probably generalize to most of the other social media networks, that are most strongly correlated with the personality trait of extroversion. So people who are outgoing, social, they thrive in these exciting, stimulating environments. And you can see this reflected in the word cloud, right? So people talk about weekends out, parties, love, nights, excited. So you see this kind of social stimulating element in here, especially when you contrast it to the word clouds that are more indicative of being introverted. So people who are much more happy with their own company, much more reserved and quiet. And your kind of anime, internet, manga reading, those are all activities that you don't need other people for, right? You can happily sit at home, read a book, browse the internet without necessarily having this exciting stimulation from a social environment. Here's the one that I first of all love to use with public audiences who are not academics, because it just very nicely drives the point home. It's the personality trait of agreeableness. So people who are caring, trusting, empathetic, place a lot of value on their social relationships on the one hand. And you can see this borne out in the data again, right? So there's like this warm glow where people talk about wonderful, blessed, excited. There's a lot of references to religion. So this general, I think, sense of gratitude. Word of warning, the one for low agreeableness. So those are people who are critical, competitive, looks totally different. And what I always say when you're talking to non-scientists, like, first of all, we're not cherry picking. We're not just going into the data and pick the ones that make for a funny word cloud. And it also doesn't mean that if you that people who are critical and competitive swear all the time. It's essentially a probabilistic relationship, right? If you happen to feel comfortable swearing on social media, the chances that you're also somewhat more critical and competitive just goes up. And for me, those two word clouds show it's not rocket science, right? A lot of it actually makes intuitive sense and has really good face validity when you look at it. Now, on the flip side, there's also relationships that actually tell us something new about psychology and the human mind that we probably didn't know before. And this is something that I still remember. There was a big psychology conference, and the room was full of personality psychologists, so people who think about this all the time. And the speaker, Jamie Pennebaker, who's a pioneer in the world of natural language processing in the context of psychology, he just asked the room, he's like, there's this interesting pattern that I found between the use of first-person pronouns, so I, me, myself, and a psychological dimension that you all have heard of, and I want you to guess which one it is. And I remember sitting around the table just talking to my colleagues and friends, and we were all sure that it was going to be narcissism. I think we were all like, if you talk about yourself all the time, you're probably somewhat more narcissistic than the average person. Turns out that that's not actually the case. What it is indicative of is actually emotional distress. So if you kind of are somewhat anxious, depressed, and you're currently struggling with life, if you kind of think back to a situation where that might have happened to you to varying degrees, is in that moment, you probably don't think about the world's biggest problems, right? You don't think about, well, how do I solve climate change and so on? What you think about is yourself. You think about, well, why am I feeling so bad? Do I ever get better? How do I get better? What would I have to do to get better? And this inner monologue that we have with ourselves just creeps into the language that we use on social media and elsewhere, so much so that I think people who are depressed use first-person pronouns about 40 times more often than people who are not. So again, it's just like this very interesting and somewhat subtle indication of here's something that's going on inside your mind that we might have just totally overlooked from like a theoretical theorizing part. You can also, and this is actually where all of this research started, and I'm showing you this because it's going to become relevant a little bit later on when I talk about applications, is this relationship between personality traits, again, in this case, another one of the big five, just open-minded and traditional, with Facebook pages that you can follow. And the way that I think about Facebook pages are essentially very explicit signals of interests, right? So if you follow science on Facebook, for example, in this case, makes you more open-minded, but it doesn't really matter if that's a like on Facebook or if that's you reading science article, the same way as if you were to follow Lady Gaga, for example, on Facebook. You could also go to her concerts, you could listen to her music. So I think of these as like these broadly construed indications of interests that people can express. And again, here you can see that it makes sense, right? So people who are intellectually curious, open-minded, they're interested in science, but also stuff like fantasy novels, thunderstorms, and then you have like on the more traditional and conservative side, kind of beauty products, Harley Davidson, and maybe something that doesn't require you to kind of really dig deep into a topic. Now, how accurate are some of the predictions that we can make? And this, I should say, is research that was published like 10 years ago now. So you can imagine that accuracy has gone up since. But the question that one of my colleagues asked when I was still in Cambridge at the Psychometric Center is, how do we quantify accuracy in a way that's more intuitive for people who don't live and breathe this kind of the data world? And what she said is like, why don't we compare the accuracy of a computer prediction to the accuracy of people in our environment who should know us pretty well. And kind of as humans, we make these judgments all the time, right? As humans, we make inferences about other people all the time. So can we have like this man versus machine race and see how well a computer does in comparison to these other people? So what she did is, the way that it would work is, I would complete a questionnaire for myself. So you give me statements like, I'm the life of the party. How strongly do you agree with this? I complete it for myself. An algorithm, and super simple. So this is a super simple lasso regression. So kind of linear prediction based on Facebook likes and these interests, predicts my personality. And now I also ask my coworkers, my friends, family members, and spouses to complete the questionnaire on my behalf. So they would be asked, how do you think, like Sandra would answer this question of, I'm the life of the party. Do you think she would strongly agree, and so on. So what she found back in the day, again, about 10 years ago now, is that a computer needs access to only about 10 Facebook likes, so 10 interests to be better than colleagues, 65 likes to be better than friends, 120 likes to be better than family members. And again, those are people who should know you pretty well. So this includes kids, siblings, parents. They spend a substantial amount of time with you, and about 300 likes to be better than the spouse. When the study was conducted, the average number of likes in the data set was 230. So back in the day, the computer already outperformed pretty much everybody in our environment other than the spouse, just by looking at your Facebook likes. And you can imagine that if I were to get access to this more holistic set of data that shines light on your psyche from different angles and use better models, we might be pushing the boundary even further. Now, for me, the interesting part, and you can't give a talk about the topic without mentioning ChatGPT and generative AI, so here it goes. But for me, the interesting part is, first of all, we know that you can make very similar predictions now with these off-the-shelf models, right? If I ask ChatGPT, here's a social media post of a person, what do you think is their big 5 personality profile? Or I can have a chatbot, have a conversation with me that's not necessarily geared towards assessing my personality, but it's just like we tell them, like, get to know the other person as if this was a first encounter. They are actually really good at making the same predictions. They've never obviously explicitly been trained to translate traces into psychological traits, but because they've read the entire internet and they kind of are based on these human narratives, they can make predictions that are almost as accurate. So if you just give it passive social media data, it's almost as accurate as a supervised model. If you give it an opportunity to interact with a person, it's actually more predictive, which makes sense, right? Because if you have a model that that has the ability to ask questions, it also gets a sense of like, what is it that it doesn't know? So if I don't know yet enough about whether you're more neurotic or emotionally stable, well, I can just follow up with some questions. So the reason for why I think this is in a way interesting is not just that it tells us something about the ability of LLMs, it also democratizes the process of profiling. So back in the day, what I needed was this proprietary data set that had access to, let's say, Facebook status updates and your big 5 personality self-reported. Not just that, I also then needed to train my model to kind of make the connection. So that meant both in terms of research and in terms of applications, that it was somewhat limited to the people who had access to the data and to the models. And it was also very limiting. You could only make the predictions based on the traces and the specific traits, right? If I had access, I had a model that translates language to big 5 personality traits, amazing. If I now have access to credit card spending, that model is completely useless. So if I want now personal values, that model is also completely useless. Clearly not the case for these LLMs. You can pop in pretty much anything that you like and ask for pretty much any output. And it does, at least to some extent, a good job at understanding who that person is, certainly compared to baseline. Okay, the second part. So what does it mean? Right? Once I get these insights into your psychology, what power does that give me? And there's this catchphrase that I'm sure most of you will have heard in one way or another: data is the new gold. Sometimes it's data is the new oil. And a friend of mine at some point back in 2013 said, big data is like teenage sex. Everyone talks about it. Nobody really knows how to do it. Everyone thinks everyone else is doing it. So everyone claims they're doing it, which I think was a very, very good description of the space of big data and data science back in 2013, because everybody, like all of the companies, were just hoarding data, right? There was like, okay, there's like suddenly something that seems to be valuable, so let's get into the business, collect all of this data, and then it was just sitting there. So I've like spoken to so many companies back in the day that were just like, okay, we have all of this data, we have no idea what to do with it. And the truth is that it's not the data that itself that is valuable, right? The data is only as valuable as the insights that you can extract from the data. And one of these, the value, where the value comes from, is your ability to influence your behavior, right? The same way that humans are extremely good at understanding who's on the other side and how do I adjust the way that I communicate, not just in terms of what I talk about, but also how I talk, to who's on the other side. Kids know that, right? Kids are amazing at figuring out, how do I convince my dad to get the candy, as opposed to how do I convince my mom to get the candy. So as humans, this customization and personalization is so natural and so is instinctive that we oftentimes don't even think about it anymore. And the question is, can we replicate some of this in an online space where it's not a face-to-face, but we can still get similar insights about the person who's on the other side? So one of the first studies that we did, and we've now shown this in different contexts, it doesn't always work. So I think where the current focus is on research is like, under which conditions does insights do insights into people's psychology actually translate in into power of persuasion? But one of the first studies that we did was essentially with Facebook. And this is now coming back to what I mentioned earlier, is that certain interests we know are empirically associated with certain personality traits. So on Facebook and Google, you can't explicitly target people based on a certain personality profile, right? You can't tell Facebook, I want an extroverted audience, or I want an introverted audience. Certainly not because they can't do it. Facebook actually has a patent in 2015 showing that they can predict personality traits from their own internal data. So the fact that they were surprised by Cambridge Analytica seems to be a little bit of a myth, at least when it comes to commercialization of their patents. But they don't offer it to advertisers explicitly. But what you can do is you can say, well, I can target based on the usual social demographics, but I can also target based on interests. And now, because I know that certain interests are empirically associated with certain personality traits, by mere association, I can define an audience that is more likely to be extroverted or more likely to be introverted. And this is an incredibly crude way of targeting. So it's not that an algorithm gets access to all of my data, makes a prediction of who I am in terms of my big five personality traits, and then uses that. The only thing that we did here is we said, give me an audience, give me a group of people. I don't even know who is in that group of people. So at least in this case, it was a bit more privacy preserving. That are connected to at least one of these likes, and that puts them in the extroverted bucket. So you could imagine that there were a lot of misunderstood introverts in the extroverted bucket, and vice versa. But it's one way in which you can somehow, at least on average, separate extroverts from introverts. And the empirical context that we looked at was it was a collaboration with a beauty retailer. So this is a beauty retailer in the UK, and their goal was to get women, in this case, click on an ad on Facebook, go to the website and buy something. So they were agnostic as to what women bought. And the idea was, we're not going to suggest different types of products. What we do is we try to adjust the way that we frame beauty as a whole. So in this case, the extroverted ads would always be something that's like stimulating, exciting. It's a woman on like the dance floor, saturated colors. I think in this case, the text said something like, dance like no one's watching, but they totally are. So playing with the need of extroverts to be the center of attention. And then the introverted one would say something like, beauty doesn't have to shout. So something that just kind of reflects more of like, you're doing this for yourself. And what we saw back in the day with this very crude way of targeting, and the only thing that we customized was the one ad that people saw on Facebook, was already kind of a 50% increase in purchases for matched ads. So in this case, how often did women buy something compared to how often the ad was shown? We've shown similar effects in other contexts where in some studies, we tried to flip the purpose on its head and said, could we get people to save more by playing into their psychology? And again, there we saw about like a 60% increase in the people who managed to hit their save on goal. So you don't always see these effects that are relatively large, but at least we kind of have a sense of like, what are some of the targets that we could hit, and what power does that give us? I should also say, and this is something that I've been thinking a lot about more recently, is it almost feels like a problem of the global commons. Like if you're the only beauty retailer doing that, maybe it's going to give you a boost, right? Because it makes your audience feel like you understand them and so on. But if all of the beauty retailers suddenly started doing that, maybe it just becomes super boring and it feels like, I'm just seeing the same thing again and again, the same way that we've seen this with behavioral targeting. So this is like really just in a way focusing on an one incident of a beauty retailer. Not surprisingly, generative AI can also do that. So you're no longer limited to a human workforce that can only work on one ad. You can just, and this is just one example, we've shown this in different contexts as well, like write me a short ad for an iPhone that speaks to a person who scores high on the personality traits of openness and extroversion. So it can now cross these traits, and you don't have to tell it what extroversion and openness are. It just knows it. So you kind of execute. It comes up with an ad that is pretty remarkable when you think about these two traits: unleash your creativity. So that's tapping into openness and connect like never before. That's probably more focused on extroversion. Now, could a human expert do even better than that? Maybe, but I think it usually gets us about 90% of the way there. By the way, that's also one of the reasons for why I think psychology is actually still useful, is that it allows for human AI collaboration, right? So if an AI is based on personality or something psychology that we can make sense of, as opposed to just like a million behavioral dimensions, it can communicate to the human, says, here's what I'm trying to optimize for, help me make it even better, which is really hard if we're just working with behavior. You can take this a step further and say, okay, now that you've created this ad, also write me a prompt for DALL-E to create an image that goes with this ad. Again, it does like a pretty great job just coming up with a description of like, it's an energetic and vibrant scene, like a young, stylish person. And you could imagine if you could totally customize that, right? You could say, well, we are doing this for a 50-year-old person living in the US, somewhere in like a rural. So you can kind of take it to a much more personalized level. If you put this in DALL-E, again, it does a pretty good job. Not perfect. If you look at the faces, they're still somewhat scrambled, right? I don't think AI is at a point yet where if I was a luxury beauty retailer, I would just give it a go and have the entire process automated. But it's probably just a matter of time. Same is true for videos. I just popped the same prompt into Sora, which is OpenAI's video generation program. And again, it does a pretty remarkable job. Should we be terrified and elated? I think both as like a good scientific answer. On the one hand, it's clearly, coming back to this village, a question of privacy and agency, right? And for me, the agency part is probably the more interesting part, because it's not just that people are being able to peek into our psychology, but it also raises questions of like, are the choices that we make even still our own, right? If there's someone who can understand our motivations and needs, preferences, desires, and then meddle with them and potentially shift us in a direction that, yeah, maybe we wanted to go in anyway, but maybe we didn't. It's like, it is a pretty substantial question about agency and self-determination. Also, my concern, and this is true almost even more so when we think about the next generation of like us having digital twins who make decisions on our behalf, what I'm really worried about is us just becoming really boring. Right, because you can imagine we have a digital twin and we have like a distribution of preferences. The digital twin is optimizing for what's the most likely thing that Sandra, given her preferences, is wanting next. And that's by definition kind of somewhere focused around our average. So my concern is that we're just going to be squished in our complexity and become increasingly boring. But there's also all of these, I think, really remarkable opportunities, right? Thinking back to the village, there was something nice to have people understand who you are and help you move in the direction that you want to go in and accomplish the goals that you have for yourself that are otherwise difficult. That could be anything from saving, which is something that, again, I said before, we've studied and shown that actually you can help people save more, because most people have the motivation. Very few people actually manage to execute. So this big gap between intention and action. Education is another one that I think is just going to be completely different over the next couple of years. I'm in some way really excited that my my son is going to grow up in a world where he can just have education that's probably a bit more customized to his needs. And not just my son, who I might be able to send to a really good school where teachers pay attention to him, but also people who otherwise don't have access to the same level of education. Mental health, or just generally health, I think another one of these contexts where the current way that we're tracking and treating is just so horrific, in the sense that you have to be really sick to go to a doctor who then kind of just looks at your current symptoms and prescribes something that works for the average person. So if we think about like the proactive health and being able to continuously monitor how you're doing, and then also offer advice way before you enter a full depressive episode, and maybe advice that we know works particularly well for someone with your lifestyle, your genetic makeup, your kind of health history. I think there's just these incredible opportunities. Now, this kind of brings me to the last part, which, and I'm only briefly going to talk about this, this question of like, if we really believe that there's these opportunities, but also these costs, how do we navigate this? And one of the things that I discuss in the book, which I thought would be interesting for this group, and I certainly have not ironed out the details, so I would love to hear people's opinions. But there's this one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, is that most of the data protection regulations are very much focused on transparency and control. But the idea, it's your data and you should take back control. And I think those are absolutely necessary principles. I don't think that they're sufficient. And the way that I kind of currently, the analogy that I currently use is, it's almost like putting people in charge of their own sailing boat. And this is, again, generated by DALL-E, made me very happy because it messed up the legs and the steering wheel. So it felt like we still have an edge as humans. So there's like something that it can't do, and we're still a little bit better. So that's why I'm keeping this messed up image. But it's like putting you in charge of your sailing boat. And that's an amazing proposition if you're drifting along the Mediterranean Sea, right? If the water is calm, the weather is good, and you can only make good choices, like any town that you pick is going to be great because it has an old cathedral and an ice cream shop. Being in charge and being in control of your boat in this environment, fantastic. I would argue that that's not the environment that we're in. I think the environment that we're currently in is more like a raging thunderstorm where there's a gazillion emergencies at the same time. Like everybody is trying to exploit our data for their own benefit. And we can almost only make bad choices. And in that context, I don't think that being in charge of your own boat or your own data is actually as much, is right. I think it's much more of a responsibility and a burden that few of us, if any, are equipped to take on. So if I think about myself, it's hard enough to keep up with the pace at which technology is moving, right? I think about this 24/7 and I have a hard time. And nobody really wants to spend their entire life 24/7 managing their data. Like there's almost no way that I can read through all of the terms and conditions, legalese, fully figure out what are the implications of me giving my data away today, maybe in the future. Like we could say goodbye to all of our family meals, meeting friends, getting any work done, because that's the only thing that we would be doing. So for me, this idea of like, how do we not just put people in charge, but actually create an environment and give them a competent crew. So when I kind of sticking to this analogy, I've been thinking a lot about how do you tame the sea? And some of that is regulation, right? It could be changing the default. Some of it I think is technology. So technologies like federated learning, which essentially allow you to keep your data in a safe spot on your phone, but still getting the intelligence. So the way that Siri is trained, for those not familiar with federated learning, is essentially instead of you sending all of your speech data to Apple, to a central server to build their models, they just send the model to your phone, which is a supercomputer. It's like so much more powerful than the computers that we used to launch rockets to space with just a few decades ago. So I can keep my data safe on the phone, but I can still get the same data at the same personalization, convenience, and service. So kind of thinking about how do we make it a lot easier for people to do the right thing. And then the second part is what I think of as a competent crew. So even if we assume that the sea is going to be rough for a while, because it's probably, even if we manage to tame it at some point, it's probably going to take some time. And we never know when the next thunderstorm is going to come our way. So we do want to be prepared. And how I think about this competent crew is essentially brings me back to full circle to the village. Because so when I was growing up there, my parents still owned vineyards. So they still had like these parcels of land, and we were growing grapes and went to go harvest every fall, which is amazing as a kid, really fun. It becomes hard work when you grow into an adult. But most families in that region still have like some of these vineyards, but way too small to produce your own wine, right? So you don't have enough grapes, and you certainly don't have the expertise to do that. So what happens in the region is you have these wine co-ops. So families come together in these member-owned entities. We pool grapes, and either we then sell them on at a better price to a bigger winery, or we hire experts who help us make the wine. And you can translate the same context to concept to the data-driven world, right? So instead of pooling grapes, could we form these member-owned entities in the form of data co-ops that, first of all, have fiduciary responsibility? So they're legally obligated to act in your best interest. And they also now have expertise to make the most of your data. There's one in Switzerland that I really like, which is called My Data, which essentially kind of does that in the health space. So one of the examples is they work on MS, on multiple sclerosis, which is one of these diseases that is so poorly understood because it's determined by your genetics, your lifestyle, like the environment, your medical history, and many, many more factors. And so you need quite a lot of data to understand it. What typically happens is that, if anything, pharma companies are the entities that hold that data. Worst case, you just give your data away and you never benefit from it. In the best case, you're going to now spend thousands, if not millions of dollars on using the drugs that they come up with in like a 10 years time. So what My Data does, it brings together patients suffering from MS and also like healthy control in the kind of a control group, right? So you can contrast it. And it not only kind of allows them to better understand the disease as a whole, but it also gives advice to patients in real time. So essentially, it's almost like an Amazon recommendation algorithm, right? It says, we've seen patients go through some of these symptoms, and we know that these treatments have worked particularly well for these types of individuals. So we're going to communicate as the data co-op with your provider, so with your doctor, to kind of communicate some of these findings and recommendations. Now they implement and they treat and they decide what they actually want to do. And then they can also kind of close the feedback loop and come back to the data co-op and said, yeah, we tried treatment A, which you recommended, worked, it didn't work. So totally different way of thinking about data, right? Because it really empowers the person as opposed to these big entities that otherwise exploit it. And for me, kind of both federated learning and these data co-ops are really helpful complements to regulation, because regulation in a way kind of tries to kind of protect you from the most egregious abuses, right? It kind of tries to protect the average person from being exploited, but it doesn't usually help us maximize the utility that we can get from data. So for that, you kind of need this more flexible support. And I think data co-ops are just a really, really interesting way of thinking about data governance that gives us control, but also just doesn't put us in charge of our own sailing boat with any support. And with that, that's it for the main part, and I'm excited for questions.